Well, we got to jump into another episode of Ceasefire podcast, and this one, episode 16, Drag Queens and Children? What is going on? This was debated months ago, and it's coming back again as a debate. Should there be drag parties for children, and should drag queens be interacting with children is a question I didn't think we'd ever have to ask, but we're asking that question with my good friend Andrew. Good to see you. Let's just jump in. We have a video. It's a debate about whether or not drag queens are appropriate for children. So let's just jump right in. The original link to the video will be below. And if you want to support this show directly, go to ceasefirepodcast.com.
Is drag an art form? Is drag an art form? That's what I want to know. It's maybe been around for centuries, has it? But are performers better known for their risque performances, their blue humour, their provocative outfits? And is that appropriate for children? Well, it's a question facing parents following the arrival, of course, of the new so-called Drag Queen Story Hour in the UK. It launched stateside in 2015. It was set up to, quote, inspire a love of reading while teaching deeper lessons on diversity, self-love, and an appreciation of others. But in recent days as well, there's also been outrage, hasn't there, over footage coming out of Dallas, which has prompted lawmakers in Texas and Florida to call for a ban on bringing children to drag shows. Well, campaigners, of course, are now calling for the event, which is returning next.
Obviously, just a little warning, some of this footage is a little on the line, which I think is where people are, going with this. I don't know what happened months ago with Texas and the law. I don't really feel like discussing whether or not the bills or whatever got passed. It's more about the discussion of, is this appropriate? And you're about to see footage that's clearly adult-oriented content and dancing and outfits. So just a little fair warning. It's not like nudity or anything, but, just so people know what they're about to see.
Next month for a nationwide tour to be banned outright. And they don't think this kind of thing would ever fly in Britain. Well, last year, Redbridge Central Library apologised after one drag artist turned up. You're not going to want to miss this one, ladies and gentlemen. Dressed as a rainbow monkey bearing a fake bare buttocks and brandishing an actual sex toy.
I love the irony that they had to blur the child out in the footage, too.
The child is blurred, not the dancer.
to protect the child,
I shouldn't be laughing.
Let's blur the child. We have to protect the child, and yet they're watching an adult dance in an outfit that's not neutral. It's not neutral. Anybody who claims this is neutral is selling me something that I'm not buying.
I don't know if this is real. I feel like it's staged and somehow, what was that old show where the guy pranks people and then the other guy jumps out and is like, not punked, but it was before that. It was the
surprise,
show that
you're on candid camera.
Yeah, that whole thing. I feel like it's one of those deals. So far removed am I from this world that is coming more and more common.
Yeah.
So continue. I am just in awe of the spectacle.
The thing that I want to set the stage for is children, and this I think is there's a level about this, not specifically with drag queens. I just big picture here. I think this is sort of a disgusting thing that's been happening, that we're using children as the battleground. Like, that's where the battleground is taking place. Can we go in and teach children about alternative lifestyles and drag queens and children under the age of 9 and 10 learning about all this? I just think that's disgusting. That's even the effort of the culture battle. Like, leave children out of this. I think that's reprehensible. And I think this is just another example where you're trying to use children to push forward some level of an agenda, and they'll say that it's not an agenda, but I refuse to believe this is neutral.
And of course, by just putting that thought out there, we are bigoted, conservative fear mongers, right. MAGA Republicans, QAnon, conspiracy theorists, misinformation peddlers. Let's think of some more labels. Freedom
Right.
whatever the word
Well,
is.
maybe we should say up front, like, I don't care if somebody, I would be very interested into, what leads somebody to a place where they like to do drag. I'm not going to sit there and be like, you shouldn't have rights or you shouldn't be able to do that. I don't have any issue with that. But we're talking about children that don't have categories
We're talking about
for this
pushing
stuff.
something that is very fringe, and it will never not be fringe, no matter, if it goes from 0.7% to 1.2% of the population. This is still fringe ideology here on the masses, attempting to normalize it so that those that take part in this lifestyle can be more accepted and not be made to feel bad and all of the above. But that's a slippery slope, and we'll get into that a little bit more. You can continue the video.
Yeah, let's see the discussion.
Yes, that's right. That actually happened. Anyway, but what do you think? Are drag queens appropriate for children? Well, let me know your thoughts. Email in right now, dan@gbnews.uk. Tweet me at gbnews and vote in our poll while you're there as well. I'll bring you the results very, very shortly. But doing battle on this, not before time as well, is Cherry Valentine, star of hit TV show RuPaul's Drag Race UK, and author and journalist Laura Dodsworth. Cherry, I'll start with you. Thank you very much, especially for coming into the studio, sashaying your way in, some would say. But
you are very welcome.
Yes, so look, should people like you be performing in front of kids?
I think that's a really silly question, to be honest.
I get that a lot.
Like, when you mentioned just about the monkey and the person being dressed as a monkey, that's completely irrelevant to the whole picture. I mean, you didn't mention anything about children actually getting something good from drag.
What do they get from it?
Well, I've just done a tour over the last 3 months and met thousands of children under 18, and all of them were there and absolutely loved every second of it. And their parents were there and they enjoyed every moment and said how much it helped their children feel like they could become themselves a bit more. There's so much good in it, and I think it's difficult to just focus on the bad. We can't just pick out a minority inside a minority and make it the whole thing, No.
Well, okay, so first things first, just because people enjoyed it doesn't make it right.
Just because people applauded out of politeness doesn't mean they enjoyed it.
Right, you could show children movies that are not appropriate for them to see. It's above their category of thought, whether it's violent or scary, or it has adult themes in it, or, people dancing in ways or doing very, very sexually suggestive things. And you would say that is not appropriate. If a middle school teacher rolled the television into the room and showed kids adult content, he would likely be prosecuted. And I think just to be like, oh, people enjoyed it, sure, you can sit there dressed nicely with makeup on, and I don't think anybody would be that upset thinking that, oh, this person interacted with my children, because most kids would not have a clue that's a man dressed like that, because their makeup and their ability to transform themselves is pretty remarkable. That's typically not what this is looking like. The footage that people are seeing these are adult-themed parties that are being thrown, and children are present. It's disgusting. It's not a nicely dressed man being polite and kind and reading a book. I'm sure there are people doing that, but you can't act like this is neutral and just justify it because people enjoyed it.
It's the sexual nature of it all, and the fact that children, they're not even sexually aware. They're not even developed enough to understand that.
Right.
There's a reason why we have certain laws. Now, the ages are a little bit different from country to country, but the consensus in civilization is that sexuality needs to be reserved for, people who are mature enough to understand it. And that goes for entertainment, that goes for discussion, that goes for especially classroom. This is, sexuality is such a deep, soul connected concept and thing. And it needs to be treated very gently with people that are still forming.
Yeah.
That's where the problem is here. It's not an attack on someone's alternative lifestyle, and anyone who would like to, I'm speaking for myself and you. Us making comments on this is not an attack on alternative lifestyles, okay? You do have, especially in America, the right to be who you want to be, and if you are being persecuted because of that, that's wrong.
Yeah.
But on the other side of the fence, you don't have any more right than I do to push your ideology down someone's throat and force them to acquiesce to your view on things, because that's the same thing as saying, Christians are judgmental, and we hate Christians and Christianity because they're always pointing fingers at people and they're hypocrite. It's the same thing. It's just different skin. What I mean? It's a different lifestyle.
I'm sure they would push back and say it's not sexual, which I'm sure in their mind they have a category for this not being a sexual thing. They enjoy dressing like women. They enjoy, and it's not cross-dressing. It's not just putting on women's clothing. Like, doing drag is very accentuated. The makeup, everything is very flamboyant and exaggerated. It's a very hyperbolic expression of what we would consider to be feminine dress types and clothing types and then makeup. And they would say it's not sexual, but I don't agree with that. I don't
understand how you could conclude that unless you live in a hyper sexual state of reality that most folks don't, and that's just normal for you. I guess that's what this is all about, is like, this is what's normal for us. You know what I mean? Come over and see it from our perspective, type of thing.
Well, and it would be odd to try to deny that, because so many of the expressions, if you've watched any of the shows, if you've seen the outfits, if you've seen sort of the drag queen, the bars and the places where they have like the contests and stuff, to argue that there's not a sexual nature to it, I think is naive. I really do. Now, obviously, when you come on a show like this and you dress sort of in slightly flamboyant business attire, that's just like a blouse. Well, obviously, that doesn't look sexual at all. That just looks like you have tons of makeup on and very extravagant jewelry, but that's not the only expression of drag. That's not the only way it shows up. And many people that know of it, that's the expressions they've seen, the very exaggerated, very sexualized versions. And then the footage came out, and it was clear that there were people pushing the line. They were not just showing up to a library to like have, story time with kids with makeup on. Like, I saw footage of that, and I'm like, I'd be a little uncomfortable with that, because my kids aren't ready to have that discussion. Like, they will one day learn about these things, but my kids are 7 and 9. Like, they're just going to the library to hear books about puppies and stuff. They're not there to suddenly have a fringe category, as you described it, thrust in their face that they don't understand. It's going to be confusing. And not, I don't think, something that should be taken lightly, especially if you're from that side of the fence. Like, if you think drag is great and you love it and you want people to respect it and accept it, I don't think that's the way you do it. You don't preemptively sort of put it in places where children are exposed to it at an age where it just seems completely inappropriate.
Yeah, and notice none of our commentary has to do with, like, quoting scripture or talking about right and wrong, right? In the context of morality. We're not debating the morality of the lifestyle choice. We're debating the morality of pushing this on kids who are not developed enough to interpret the data with any sort of objectivity.
Yeah And whenever they were pushing some of the sex education stuff, and they wanted certain things to be present, they wanted certain things to be talked about, and parents were pushing back, I did research into why we wait until certain ages to even broach the subject of, like, anatomy, reproduction. This is what, intercourse is. And it's because not until the ages between 10 and 12 did they even start to really grasp that there are sharp differences between a boy and a girl. And then even when we teach them at that age, it's very descriptive. It's not prescriptive. We're not prescribing that, oh, yeah, you should go out and have sex or, not have sex. You're just describing, like, this is how basically babies are made. It's meant to educate it's not meant to proselytize. Like, no, and I had problems with schools that were trying to teach abstinence only, because it's like, well, that's kind of an ideology, right? You can describe it, and children should probably be empowered with good information about safe sex, and they should have access. And people are like, well, if they have access to that, they're going to have more sex. Well, then you end up with unwanted teen pregnancies, which is a whole nother discussion. But I think education's not the same as sort of proselytizing for your view and the way that you want to live. And that's where that discussion drove me to research it. And all childhood development psychological studies agree certain things are just completely inappropriate to be broaching with children. And I think so many people miss that in these discussions because they make it about love and acceptance, not about what's appropriate at certain ages when a child is developing.
Yeah, I think you articulated that very well.
All right, let's listen to more.
No, hey, fair enough, Laura. I'll lob it over your way now. Laura Dodsworth, of course, author and journalist. Look, some of the videos coming out of Dallas are shocking, but I do believe that what Cherry's saying there is that's an extreme example, and we shouldn't be focusing on those things.
Yeah, no, it is an extreme example, and I don't think we can confuse that really bizarre scene of children going to quite an explicit drag show in an adult venue with libraries and education. I think the question to ask is, do drag queens have a vital role in helping children learn to read and love stories? Because while children might be able to get something from drag, Cherry's just talked about some benefits. Is reading, our libraries, the place? Is there a different format? I mean, I think overall as a society, we are very open-minded and tolerant. And I'm all in favour of encouraging people to be open-minded about gender non-conformity and different sexualities. And, lots of people take their kids to the pantomime at Christmas. And, the Danes are, I guess, a type of drag queen. Sorry if I'm getting that wrong, but, that's kind of how it looks to me. There's a similarity there. But drag queens, at least the ones I've seen, it feels a bit more like it's kind of evening entertainment. There can be innuendo and adult themes. And also there's, elements of the costume that you could arguably say present kind of a sexist view of womanhood. I think there's a lot of confusion at the moment about sex and gender. And I think maybe when it comes to teach children to read, perhaps it could just be about the basics of reading.
Laura,
Can
absolutely.
I just say one more thing? Patrick? Because you mentioned the guy that was referred to as the rainbow dildo butt monkey.
Yes, I remember. I think we all remember that guy, yes.
But there was also another example. Glencoates Primary School in Paisley in Scotland invited a drag queen called Flo Job to read stories to children. And while I don't think anything inappropriate happened in the classroom, actually this is somebody who has a very sexual social media feed, and that was all over the media too. So things do go wrong.
All right, Laura, I'm going to come back to you, Laura. Laura, I'm going to come back to you. Absolutely fair enough. I know there's a lot to get stuck into here. Cherry, thank you for sitting there so patiently with that. There's a lot for you to come back on there. I suppose, can I just ask this now, as you said...
Before he asks his question, I like the way she framed that. Like, she's accepting of alternative lifestyles. She's accepting of these people, but she's like, what does this have to do with reading? Like, what? Like, that's a fair question.
Right.
Like, what does this have to do with reading? Like, that, how is this going to help children read? That's why I said it's not neutral. This is about, I honestly feel like so much of this is about people dealing with their own issues. It's like if they...
Yes, of course. Our whole world has fallen off the narcissistic cliff. You know what I mean? Everything is about me and my feelings. Right?
Yeah, it's not
I'm
about
raising my hand here because
right.
I'm the front man for a rock band. Born as an only child. Like, I'm familiar with me. You know what I mean? In fact, I wake up every day and pray about it. But we've, as a civilization, have... my thought in watching this is not about kids.
Yeah.
This is not about you educating kids. It's about you using kids to normalize something. They're a tool in a greater game.
Yeah.
And obviously the end game here is let's make sure that emerging generations, have a completely different worldview and morality regarding so many things. And it's not just this one issue. And that's why children are being targeted, in schools, and education is the battleground right now for a lot of different issues.
Yeah.
This just being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I have to say this. we live in a country where we embrace the idea that you can be you. You know, you can come from your cultural background and come here and be a part of this melting pot. We've, defended free speech, as an integral part of our society and the grand experiment that is America. That is not what I'm saying here. I'm not pushing my ideology on someone else. I just don't want it pushed on me or my kids, because that's the same thing in reverse. I'll keep coming back to that.
Well, and if it's in the schools and if it's in a public library, that's why this is being debated, because if you want to throw your own private, gathering or story time and you invite children, then parents know what they're signing up for. If there are parents that think that's really valuable, I'd love to have a discussion
That's
as
on
to
them.
why,
Yeah.
but that's on them. But if
That's
I
on
take
them.
my kids to the
None of my
public
business.
library, I think that's supposed to be a neutral place. That's supposed to be about as neutral as it could get. And a drag queen reading a book to children's not neutral. And if you just look at it pragmatically and you say, what would be best for the kids during a story time? What would be best for a child's education with respect to sex and anatomy? If you just get purely pragmatic, all of these issues are distractions. They're disruptive. They're not conducive to education. They're not conducive to helping the children. It is a selfish act that I think needs to be continually stopped for the sake of the children, not for the sake of combating someone else's lifestyle. So I'll see what they go to next.
Definitely not something I mean myself. I'm just asking this genuinely because this is what a lot of people might say. Some people might say is it forcing some kind of homosexuality onto kids or something like that? That's one of the things that a lot of the more conservative, especially Americans, would say.
I think that's an absolute outrageous idea, to be honest, that drag forces people to be a homosexual. And like she's just mentioned, sex and gender are completely different things. They really are. Sex, like myself, I can only go off my own opinions, but I'm a man. That's my sex. But my gender is so fluid, and sometimes I feel more feminine, sometimes I feel more masculine. And I think drag allows people, and especially children when they're growing up, to really just help them navigate it all, because we are being thrown things like phrases, we're being thrown new words constantly all the time. And I think, like, I'm also a qualified mental health nurse.
Right.
So I wouldn't class myself as a sexual person in drag. I just use it for artistic reasons. I use it for self-expression, to play with gender, to really like question what we think is like how we should be in a society.
And there's that dividing line where you're expressing part of your gender, but there's nothing sexual about it. And I just think that dividing line is not shared by everyone. So why would we honestly expect kids to understand that? Like, that's not... I don't even know if I agree with that dividing line. I think it's a made-up dividing line so that people can do this sort of thing and claim that, oh, it's not sexual. It has nothing to do with my sexuality. That just seems so neat and clean. And as adults struggle to figure and sort all this out, right? Pronouns, and, we've got transgendered persons, and you've got drag, and you've got people all across the spectrum of gender fluidity, as this person's just indicated. What on earth? If I can barely figure it out, what hope does a kid have? Like, why would you put kids in this confused state about reality itself? Again, it just feels selfish. It doesn't feel like it's focused on what's good for the kids. It feels like it's about you.
No, not at all. Not at all. It's about an agenda, and that's pretty clear. And I would debate anyone who would argue otherwise. Again, I coming back to the point. If you express an opposing view in the current climate, there are a bunch of negative labels attached, but we're trying to deal in objectives here, and it's just the developmental ages of children and what is appropriate for them. And we need to have boundaries on that stuff. If you want to present adult ideologies, you have to present them to adults, not to kids, and we get into indoctrination and conditioning and all of these things that we'll talk about more in the next segment. But my opinion is this is crossing lines, and it's happening a lot in society, because again, children are the battleground, and they are the pawns for the emerging ideologies and culture.
Yeah.
So children ask me all the time, like, things about mental health because of my mental health background, and I'm more than happy to talk to them about that.
Have you ever had any bad reactions, Cherry?
No, No, I haven't. No, not from children or parents that I've been with, but I have heard from other people that they have had bad reactions. I've obviously had homophobic attacks and all stuff like that, because it is very common still, whether we like to admit it or not.
Yeah, Laura, OK. You mentioned something there that I thought was interesting. I'd not given it too much thought myself, I think, for obvious reasons.
I also wanted to clarify something. His question about homosexuality and drag, they're not connected. Like, that's not a connected line. And he said conservatives and Americans might ask that. I would hope that most Americans and conservatives in America would know that there's a pretty big difference. Like, somebody can be into drag or cross-dressing, because drag queens and cross-dressing are different, and be straight. There are straight married men that love this stuff. So there are not connected lines between homosexuality and drag, and that's why I thought that question was poorly worded, especially since he acted like Americans and conservatives might ask this. It's like, the people that are against this the strongest, and they're picketing and saying that it shouldn't be happening. I don't see anybody saying that or drawing those lines. I did want to make sure and clarify that.
But you said that potentially sometimes there are elements of drag that could be deemed offensive to women. What is that? Is it over stereotypical in your view? What do you mean by that?
I think that, there's so many different ways to take it. It's fun, it's a performance, it's a kind of very heightened expression of a particular type of femininity. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily offensive to women, but it does definitely play into gender stereotypes in a way that is sexism. So I think that the idea of using drag to talk about gender nonconformity is useful, but you can't then also ignore the fact that it plays into sexist stereotypes. I just think it's all really complex. And I'm not sure that the time when you're encouraging children to learn to read and to love stories is the time to also bring in all of this complexity. I do want to very much echo what Cherry just said. I don't think children seeing drag queens is going to make them go gay. Your sexuality is your sexuality. But there is an awful lot of confusion about gender. There's kind of crazy stuff going on in schools at the moment, to do with toilets and changing rooms and,
all sorts of names, etc. Yeah, gosh.
Yeah, and you can't really escape a lot of the furore about transgender ideology. And I just think perhaps story time should be kept simple. And I think a lot of people don't really see the need for this. I think we have to be careful, because there are examples where things have happened that are just inappropriate. I mean, it's kind of horrific to think about somebody waving a Technicolor dildo around in a library to children who went along for a story time. Some serious mistakes were made. And while those are isolated examples, we've seen more of it in the United States. I think it's an American export we want to be a little bit careful about.
Okay.
I like how they say it's like an American export. Like, what?
Sorry.
and you never want to argue against something by saying it's going to lead to this. Like, slippery slope is a fallacy, right? But how do you not see that? That, like, okay, people start saying, oh, drag queens could, read to children and normalize different types of expression and, wearing makeup. And then she just describes somebody in a library waving a dildo around. It's like, well, what? How are we not supposed to look at that and think, if you give them an inch, this is what happens? If we remove one barrier, in comes, that sounds like a circus to me. Like, and I'm sure if I was into drag, that would be infuriating to be like, that's what you're making us look like, a bunch of over-sexualized crazy people that want to wave dildos around in front of children. Like, I can't imagine wanting to be taken seriously and then having that be something that represents what you do.
A slippery slope has become a cliche and a misnomer, but the idea that when you're pushing a boundary and you are doing it intentionally, Jordan Peterson talks about this in one of his more famous clips. You don't do it all at once. You do it gradually over time, inch by inch. But that's the idea of the slippery slope. It's that, if we concede to this, then this is the next thing, and then this is the next thing, and you normalize one thing and that becomes normal, and then you push, and then you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
So it's a cliche that's overused, but the idea rings true. We're talking about societal boundaries, and we do need to have boundaries. Boundaries are good.
Yeah.
Boundaries are good for everybody in the equation. I would argue having stronger boundaries about this stuff are good for people on both sides of this argument.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if you want to be taken seriously and viewed as a legitimate member of society, even if you cling to an alternative viewpoint, you would want to prioritize the perception of objectivity and
Mm-hmm.
not pushing an agenda or using children as pawns, which is how this looks.
Yeah, it doesn't. Everybody's always talking about coexisting and being tolerant, and that's not what this feels like. It doesn't feel like you're asking for rights or just being allowed to exist, because I would be right there with you. Like, if your rights were being, trotted over and you were being treated poorly or wrongfully fired or any of those things, I'd be like, hey, you can't do that. And one of the reasons that I would stand up for that is because love for your fellow man and your neighbor, but also when you protect somebody for being fired or mistreated because of what they believe or how they look, you're also protecting yourself. It's like, we cannot allow that sort of thing to take place. But that just isn't the same as going into schools, going into sexual education programs, or reading time at the library, and
there's no bullying happening here or persecution. That is not involved in this equation whatsoever.
Yeah, because I would not want any ideological things pushed into that space. I wouldn't even want my own. I would not want the public library or reading time at the library to suddenly have my beliefs ham-fisted in. I would say, that's not the place for that. That's not correct. That's not an appropriate thing to take place. So I'll be interested to see what the remainder is, because I don't remember how this ends. I did watch some of it.
Okay. I'm presuming that, Cherry, if it was banned here in this country, I suppose, any kind of drag out towards kids, would you protest over that ban, just quickly?
Would I protest? I'd share my personal opinion.
Okay. All right. Look, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate both of you coming on the show. Cherry Valentine there, of course, star of the hit TV show RuPaul's Drag Race UK, and journalist Laura.
Okay, that's good. I think he just plugged some stuff at the end. Yeah, I'm just gonna... Go ahead.
It's so important for us to debate this stuff and to talk about it, because it's not going to go away.
Yeah.
And part of what we're trying to model and embrace and explore here is, how do you engage a culture right now that is so different than where it was 10 years ago?
Right.
And how do we have conversations and respect people with alternative viewpoints, while at the same time, clinging to what we know to be true,
Yeah.
And I just think it comes down to tone and respect for other human beings, which is always there, and love for other people, Again, there's so much, language itself has been co-opted and politicized.
Mm-hmm.
So if you use certain words or if you express certain opinions, you're automatically herded into a group, which is what we're fighting against here by the very nature of this show. But I just think that children should not be the battleground.
Yeah.
Schools should not be the battleground. There has to be boundaries in society about what is okay and not okay in there. Also, given the history and foundation of our country, and obviously taking into account the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and all the things that make America what is America.
Yeah. Well, we always like to do the part one, which is either a guest or a reaction, and then part two is our own beliefs. Like, how does what we believe intersect with this subject, which obviously we've already kind of touched on, just pragmatically as dads, as citizens, like protecting children. But this is going to look a little bit different, I think, as a subject from the Christian perspective, and we want to do that in a way that's kind and loving. So that'll be part two. This was part one. If you liked it, make sure you're subscribed, hitting like, following us everywhere. And if you want to support directly for the behind-the-scenes, sort of after-the-show debrief, head over to ceasefirepodcast.com. We'll see you in part two or in the next episode.